And hello again, this is UKRLIFE with Lyudmila and Nemirya. I'm very glad that today is Andrey Illarionov who is joining us. Andrey Nikolayevich, thank you much for joining us. Hello, Lyudmila. Very glad to see you as well. All right, if you allow me, we have not talked since Donald Trump has won these elections, and I want to sincerely congratulate you with this victory because I remember very well how during the last 4 years you've been very sequentially, you were very constantly, consistently following, if I want to say that, the side of Donald Trump, and you were also weathering through different reprimands on different channels for your beliefs. And I want to give you my sincere thanks because very few people remained so stern, so following to their earlier statements, to the statements about Trump and your opinion about him. Thank you, Lyudmila. First of all, I want to congratulate you and Ukrainian people because the main winners, besides the people of the United States, there are two more peoples and two more countries who have won from this victory. It is Ukraine and Israel. Nobody else had won to such a degree from his victory as United States, Ukraine and Israel. And I would also say here that all these Ukrainians, regular citizens, citizens with power, citizens in Ukraine in all kinds of media who are pouring tons of dirt and disgusting propaganda on Trump, who still continue to pour a lot even after his victory, and I'm quite sure they will continue attacking him even later, even though some of them have already changed their tone. But even they have also significantly won on the 5th of November this year because of Trump's victory in the United States. And Ukrainians, regardless of their political views, how they treat Republicans or Democrats, if they're even aware of them, to their attitude to Trump or Kamala Harris or somebody else, nobody else had won to such a degree and so remarkably from this tectonic motion that happened in the United States. If you allow me one more reminder, and that reminder, we turned to that, Lyudmila, during the last couple of years and 8 months of this war. Remember, in our first meeting since the beginning of large-scale aggression by Putin in Ukraine, I think it was back in March of that year, the conversations about how long will this war last were very popular, and the whole media sphere in Ukraine was talking about 2 to 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. The most pessimistic ones were saying that maybe 2 months, and people were thinking they are deluded. Can I remind that myself, Andrey Nikolayevich? Sure, yeah, go ahead. When I asked you, when will this war be over, you said that the first possible time when this war can be concluded is January of 2025. And back then, it seemed not just fantastic, but something very unreal. And that's why I remember it very well. I will be coming back to the statement today several times, but I think it was too foretelling how much we'll see, I guess, but did I remember it correct? Yes, absolutely correctly, Lyudmila, and thank you very much for reproducing it in that fashion, as I said. Not that it will be over, but that it will have the first chance to be over at that time. And I want to say that it doesn't mean that in January of 25 this war will be over. It's just in January the first chance appears, which was not available during the last 2 years and 8 months, and additional 2 months between now and 20th of January. Yeah, so it'll be 2 years and 9 months altogether, right? 2 years, 9 months already passed. Time is really flying. And then, yeah, 2 more months till the 20th of January, when likely the war will still continue. And even on the 20th or 21st of January, when Trump and his new administration gain real power, that's when the chance just appears. It's not a guarantee, but it's a first chance that it will be over. But until Trump's appearance in the White House and before this victory in the US elections, this chance was not even on the table. And in one of our streams several months ago, we discussed this option. What if Trump did not win? What if Biden or Kamala wins? The answer was that there'll be a high probability that the war will last for another 4 years until January of 29, when there'll be somebody else, we do not know who, entering the White House. And with that new player appearing on the stage, we will have another chance to end this war. So I'll say once again, we can and should congratulate all Ukrainians with a remarkable event. Ukraine now obtained the chance to conclude this war and to stop the deaths of thousands and tens of thousands Ukrainian citizens. We're not talking about other things yet, but we're just talking about a chance to stop dying. And that chance only appears because or due to the change of leadership in Washington, D.C. Andrey Nikolayevich, I want to add a little bit here, and then we want to go back to the topic that we'll be discussing. In British culture, there is a good habit of living quietly, unnoticed. And this morning I wanted to send a message to Jack Sullivan: if you're going, go, and sometimes it's better to just stay quiet. I want to quote what he gave in an interview yesterday to a well-known channel. Do we see a significant difference since we gave tanks to Ukraine? Same thing as F-16s. Was there a big difference on the front? We gave them tanks, we gave them F-16s, we gave them HIMARS, we gave them Patriot systems. We gave a lot of those things that you were saying in some other conversations. We have not. And it is today that Ukraine is in the most difficult situation on the battlefront, which tells again that there is no direct connectivity between having these systems available for Ukraine and how they act on the front. There is no direct connection. The main emphasis should be made on the workforce and mobilization inside Ukraine. So Mr. Sullivan basically said that Ukraine is in such a shitty situation because they have very few warfighters, and not because the weapons were provided too little, too few, and too late. And this is my emotions here, Andrey Nikolayevich. Maybe you can reflect on that a bit, and then we can go to a different topic. You know, Lyudmila, I want to say here that it's great that he said that. And I appreciate that you used the language to translate the language of your country and the Russian language, which is one of the languages there, to send this message, to translate his statement to Ukrainians. Because thousands of people in Ukraine are still held captive by some fantastic view of whom did they deal with in Washington, D.C., in the face of Biden administration and his bureaucrats. It's great that Sullivan made this statement. The fact that he's a scumbag and scoundrel and absolutely immoral type, we knew that. We tried to say that during these last several years. Ukraine and Ukrainians did not hear that, refused to hear that for different reasons, but did not want to. Do you think it was the first time? Do you think it's his first treachery? Back in 2016, who was the author of lie, of that disgusting lie that was targeting Donald Trump? Do you remember during presidential campaign of 2016 in the United States, there was so-called information injected into election cycle that Trump was bought by Putin, that he is Putin's pooch, and that he has a secret communication between Trump's campaign and Kremlin through the server of some secret Alpha Bank computer server. And back then, this data was pitched in very professionally into the information media in the United States. A lot of sources have regurgitated and reposted that, highlighting, look, Trump has secret connections, and now we see it years past. And understandably, Trump said back then that it's bullshit and completely cooked information. But who believed him, right? There was a good part of the country who refused to. They were thinking that he was still being saved from bankruptcy by Moscow, that he was visiting Moscow and had direct ties with Putin. If we look into who was the author of this disinformation, it was Jake Sullivan, for which he obtained a position of aide to national security to the president. And there are a lot of stories with Sullivan and the others like him that smell in a similar fashion. And I'm quite sure when we'll be touching other topics in our today's discussion related to other aspects of fighting Ukraine, that is defending itself from Putin, the aggressor, and from those two-faced, lying group that is seemingly supporting Ukraine but continuously stabbing them in the back, which is Biden administration, not United States. I would not call it United States. I would say it's Biden administration that is doing that. And we'll be returning back to Sullivan, to Burns, to Austin, to Milley, to Blinken, and of course to Biden himself. But let's leave it to the appropriate moment. Let's go to more context-rich elements of today's conversation. Okay, Andrey Nikolayevich, I wanted to go back to your phrase that Ukraine is getting a chance to finish this war or turn it towards finishing with a new administration entering the White House. But I wanted to talk today not only about America and Ukraine, Trump and Ukraine, about future, but maybe look more seriously at some cofactors that may have significant influence on continuation or stoppage of this war by Russia. I wanted to talk about Trump and European security, for example, because to a degree to which Trump will be interested in Europe in maintaining and fortifying NATO will probably determine the position and role of Ukraine and possible conclusions for this war. And I'm just dropping here a few angles, and maybe you can pick what you like and return to them as you will be answering the question. I recently happened to be on the conference on European security, where there were a lot of well-known diplomats, American, British, Indian, Chinese, and the rest were present. And discussion was rather interesting because they figured out that they still don't know what Trump's arrival to the White House means for Europe. They actually do not know what will be with NATO. And another topic that I think is important is that new countries that are rising, China, India, they are starting to talk about going back to having spheres of influence for those countries that are rising. And I caught myself hearing that phrase, spheres of influence. Is it a return to the topic that Putin likes so much? Remember that ultimatum, 2021, winter, and people were laughing at this ultimatum. I remember how Russian diplomats were shrugging shoulders and saying, we thought maybe it's a joke, not a real speech, that it's really so serious for him. But I am gathering it into a big snowball here, and we can maybe untie it later and unravel it later in details. But I wanted to talk about the real interests that Trump may have in regards to Europe, European Union, and sequentially Ukraine. And another important topic that I wanted to return to is, do you think EU will be needed for Trump as an ally with his relations with the countries of Asian Pacific Rim? So many things, I don't know what you will start with and how you will pile it together, but these are the things that are on my radar. You know, I would probably start with a serious and fundamental mistake, a global mistake that captured the minds of the Western diplomatic and intellectual elites for the last 3.5 decades. After the end of Cold War, after the collapse of Soviet Union, after the end of Warsaw Pact, and those were indeed tectonic events that happened around 1980s, when after 4 years of Cold War, a rather rough Cold War, when two superpowers, two military blocs were struggling with each other, which resulted in different military conflicts in different parts of the world. These conflicts were not on the scale how the First and Second World War happened. And of course, any human, any professional in this field was asking a question. How come and why were countries evading New World War, which actually was on the horizon back in the 50s, in the 60s, and even in the 70s and early 80s, yet we still managed to avoid it. And so when one of these superpowers, one of these blocs had disintegrated, all of a sudden we discovered a new world that we have not known before. It's not surprising that at this moment, a rather well-known Francis Fukuyama, who first wrote an article and then a book, which became not just a bestseller, but became a symbol of that time, the end of history, the end of the history which humanity knew during not only the previous decades, but previous hundreds and thousands of years. It was peace, instead of the world where military competition was always present. Competition between countries, of course, remained, but what used to be most effective and most successful, most drastic solution was military solution. That was not on the table after the Western Bloc collapsed. Until then, capture of the enemy, destruction of the enemy, capture of his territory fully or partially, that was the whole motive throughout the history of humanity. And what is called Cold War now, sometimes it is called Third World War, Cold World War, even though in those third country conflicts, the amount of people who died are comparable to the previous couple world wars. But people still got a feeling that the world became different. It became more humanistic, more tolerant, more democratic, more acknowledging the interests of different groups and different civilizations. And this is exactly what Francis Fukuyama was talking about in his book. And the first 10, maybe 15 years, it seemed that this is exactly where it all is going. Indeed, all charts were showing significant shrinkage of military conflicts, terrorist acts, people dying in military conflicts. These numbers were dwindling. It seemed like the new world had started, had came upon us. And it indeed was happening until in one of the countries, a person came to power who is completely engulfed in imperial moods, who set the whole goal for his life to review the existing or presently existing system of international relations, which was in the world at that time. And he started to display his military and imperialist ambitions to Georgia, to Estonia, and of course to Ukraine. That he had done first time in September of 2003. So that's what was happening in front of our eyes. And the most important thing is that at the end of this 3 decades, the world is still coming back to the place where it was before, to the world of harshest competition between countries and blocs of countries, and use of military competition becomes again one of the most important elements of this competition. This set of tools, of course, reacts and is reflected in the world by different wars that are flashing up here and there. It doesn't matter what motives are driving the participants. This is how conflicts were solved before for the millennia, in the First World War, in the Second World War, and any other big conflict. It is not democracy that prevails over autocracy, not dictatorship over democracy. No, the strongest one prevails. If democracy ends up being stronger, it has a chance. If autocracy has more power, it becomes the winner. Whoever is stronger is the winner, becomes the winner. And this is the most serious lesson of all human civilization, I would say of thousands of years, not even hundreds of years, was completely forgotten or abandoned for the last few decades. And here it needed to be voiced to understand what's the difference between the person who had prevailed on the American presidential elections from other people who were running and who were competing on the different side against him. Those people who are in the White House right now, they are still siding with the theory of Fukuyama. It is a fantastic theory, like Gogol's hero Manilov, who is hopeful to build a bridge across the pond, put pretty salesmen on both sides of the bridge, and they'll be selling some buns for the peasants, and it will be idyllic lifestyle, which is completely decoupled from reality on the ground. And that person, Trump, who is not necessarily the most likable, many people wouldn't invite him as a guest to their wedding ceremony. It is not like some of the commentators recently said, it's not like a ball in Vienna, right? It's different. This person is different. Mr. Trump grew in New York jungle. And the moods there, the traditions there are very reminiscent to the traditions that were in existence in different countries and different cultures throughout the years. And his understanding of world was formed by his practical life in New York, and he sees the world as it is. Remember the old saying, homo homini lupus est, a man is a wolf to a man? It may be simplifying things, but generally that factor. And that's how he understands that competition exists, and he understands political situation in the same fashion. And the most important thing that he understands that internationally this is also true. And he understands that it is a different world. It's not the end of the Second World War when United States GDP was equal to the half of GDP of the world. This is not the world that existed for several decades when military potential of the United States was 75 or 80% of the military potential of the world. Today's situation is very different. Different powers have grown up, about which Putin continues to remind us. China, India, Iran, other countries have risen. And these countries, their elites, their leadership, they are not siding with Francis Fukuyama. They're following the older concept, the more traditional concept, where everybody is a wolf, and if they can take a bite, they will take a bite. And this concept of spheres of influence, which seemed to have been buried by the Western countries specifically, it was buried by the Western civilization, because it is Western countries that went through its trials, tribulations, and lessons. They indeed were colonial empires. We all remember that. They remember that. They, at the end of this quest, decided to let go of this imperial inheritance. They let these colonial empires go. At the beginning, several countries like Germany or Austro-Hungary were forced to do it. There were other countries who forced them to abdicate from their ownership throughout the world. And then after the Second World War, British, French, Dutch, Belgian made these steps consciously. They consciously refused from being empires. Yet the other players in the world are saying now, no, we're not refusing. We're not in that camp. We're not refusing from our aspirations. And this old characteristic position, very prominent throughout the ages, is now coming back to the political arena. So one can ask a question, how do we deal with these new countries, new elites, new leaders? We have two approaches. One approach is by Obama/Biden/Kamala, which implies that the leaders of the biggest, most powerful country in the world will be visiting these new countries and bending over and saying their apologies to every scumbag in other countries who are still destroying their political opponents and their competition. And of course, these new countries will be feeling the weakness from the biggest country in the world, the most powerful country in the world, and they will be feeling that, excuse my parlance, the smell of blood. And the dweller in Kremlin, he is actually the one who sniffs that blood really well. He felt it well, and he used the weakness of the West to start these wars. First, to restart Chechnya war, then Georgia, then Crimea, Donbass, Syria, a few countries in Sahel in Africa, and then the full-scale invasion to Ukraine. This is a result of his own imperial ambition as Putin and some other leaders. And now this approach is becoming more prominent, and the appetites are growing when they see the lion weakening. The jackals are becoming more active. And this weakening lion had two options. What to do? One, to continue getting weaker and to commit a grandiose suicide in the eyes of the whole world, in front of the world. And this is the program of a public suicide in the face of the world. That is what was suggested on the recent presidential elections by Biden, and he gave this baton to Kamala. And all these Ukrainian citizens and commentators and mass media, not even talking about Ukrainian authorities, who are swearing to us how well and much they support Biden and Kamala, and they're pouring dirt on Trump. They did not even understand. In English, there is a there's a phrase called TDS, Trump derangement syndrome. And it's understood that some people may not like him, but TDS in Ukrainian scenario is a syndrome of suicidal behavior. People who take Biden and Kamala as their allies and they continue pouring dirt on Trump, with their actions, they are actually bringing everything possible to fasten, to bring closer the death of their country and themselves. They're closing their ears. Some of them do not understand how it works. Others do understand, yet they still continue this behavior, including people in the Ukrainian media and people that you invite sometimes who speak fantastic Russian, Ukrainian, English, and they still listen to Biden and Kamala, and people listening to them, and they can speak pretty. But with these speeches, they only exacerbate conditions for possible suicide of Ukraine. And this strange, not a pretty, with yellow hair, some people say vulgar, violating rules here and there, this person who had won recent elections, all that is, or a lot of that is true. What Sullivan said, however, is a lie. What Blinken did, organizing the letter of 50-plus retired intel officers that Hunter Biden's laptop is a special operation by Russian counterpart, and this is not a real data, which we now know to be false, that the laptop actually was Hunter Biden's. And we're not going to even talk about Mr. Burns. He's got too lengthy of a rap sheet to talk about. But they were doing what they were doing. That is their work, their view of the world. And Ukraine needs to be considering how to survive in these new conditions. In the conditions when the neighbor on the east, on the northeast, a huge neighbor, right, historically huge neighbor, who's been there for the last few centuries, and who is saying that they should be the closest brother and the closest ally to Ukraine. And in some cases, and historically it has been so, but that neighbor actually stabbed Ukraine in the back and continues the war. If the politics of Biden, Kamala, and their administration continues, Ukraine would be facing at least 4 more years of that same war. Because we all understand, to stop the war as a truce without any guarantees or radical changes, it would only imply that Putin will gather new troops, regroup, will get more power, and will start another run on Ukraine, same as it happened after Minsk I, Minsk II. And if there would be Minsk 3 or Istanbul 1, that would have repeated again, and that would have led to the destruction of Ukraine. But it would probably be happening in a more dire situations for both Ukraine and international coalitions supporting Ukraine, because there'll be more restrictions, and even now they do have very dripper-like support and supply of military goods for Ukraine. They may not be having it in the case of the next war. And we're seeing on Donetsk front every day 10, 15, 20, 5 more villages or another township is being attacked by Russia. Just looking at the ratio of forces on the front, one can make a very simple conclusion, specifically for Ukraine, that continuation of existing politics will not only not bring victory to Ukraine, but it also will not provide an option to defend Ukraine in the future. So we can ask a question, what can change this strategy? And you can come to a conclusion that solely Ukraine itself will not be able to figure out how to resolve this issue. The forces are absolutely unequal. That means that Ukraine needs allies. And there are a lot of allies in Europe that are helping. Baltic countries, Poland, Scandinavian countries, Britain, Denmark, Netherlands, they're all providing significant help to Ukraine. And their help is material, with weapons and other things, but not with their armed forces. And this war, if it is done with conventional means, can only be stopped if Ukraine will have other countries' military forces fighting for Ukraine on Ukrainian side against the Russian aggression. We talked about that back in spring of 22, and we repeated that for several years. And some of these countries, under certain conditions, were ready to. They were putting their own terms, though. And they were saying that they would go for it if they would be protected as well, if the United States would be on their side, would be supporting them. So US still becomes a hinge, a pinnacle in their position, and the person who is taking or not taking the seat in the White House is very important in this scenario. With Biden, Kamala, and with any of the fledglings of that camp, everything is crystal clear. Their position is acknowledged. Trump's position is not exactly clear, right? Even today, we talked about that before elections, and now after elections we can say that we understand some things, but we cannot say that we understand his position crystal clear and that we know how he will act. But his appearance on the stage gives a chance that continuation of this bloodletting, continuous bloodletting of Ukraine will cease, and there will be a new approach, some kind of new approach, which will not be a repetition of the old. And new approach will have new risks, of course. And those people who are saying today and who are telling us, well, look, you're Trump or Trump's son or Bob Kennedy or Musk or Tucker Carlson or the other people. Yeah, we do see. We're not blind. We see their positions. We know what they want, and we know how they see the world and how their understanding of the world also sometimes is falsified, or they sometimes are genuinely missing some things that are happening on the front in Ukraine. And who is the author of this massive disinformation campaign? Why do they have these views, right? That's another good question. But the main decision will still be made by Trump, and he has not made them yet. He has not done what was actually expected from him and what he actually promised, right? Remember, we still remember that. He said that the moment I win, what I'll do, I will give a call to one, I will give a call to another, I will put them at the same table, and we'll find a way to end this war. At first he said that he'll try to stop the war in 24 hours, but recently he has abandoned this rhetoric. For the last half a year, I think he was maybe 8 months, he is not talking about that. He's saying that he will try to do that before his inauguration. The most positive news from Trump during the last 2 weeks was, you know what? What? that he has not called, neither one nor another, that he directly violated his pre-election promises. This is the main positive news that I can see for Ukraine. Does it imply that he is thinking? Yes, exactly. He is thinking. And he is not only thinking, he has already had enough time and he made certain decisions, I hope. Of course, we still have 2 months and he can change his mind on a few things, but as if, as in that saying, if I was the boss and I was asked what to do, I would give him an advice in this case, and I'm ready to give that advice, to not make phone calls, neither to Zelensky nor Putin, until the 20th of January. And do not try to agree with one or the other until the 20th. Why? Right? That would be your question. I think I understand, but I'm very curious. So there is some norm, right, in American law that until inauguration happens while you're president-elect, you cannot deal with matters of foreign policies. But I'm not sure I'm correct fully here. I'll rely on what you say. What idea do you have about this? Well, first of all, yes, there is a soft form limiting the political activity of president-elect until they're done with inauguration. But they can still give a call and exchange a few niceties, and, he can talk to both of them at any time. He actually did speak with Zelensky. Zelensky called him and congratulated him. They might have exchanged a few words about the possible future. 25 minutes is enough to remember what they talked about back in New York and maybe agree about certain things. It may be enough to touch on some highlights, not for the serious negotiations, but generally a quick conversation. And what about Putin? No, there was no conversation with Putin, right? And it is a very important factor. This is probably the most important part of this game, of this psychological game. All right, can we, cannot hold myself and not ask the question, is it for the first time in history that Russia did not congratulate the president-elect in the United States with the election? And second, what I heard in a stream by Alexander Motel yesterday, he, in his interview, said that he even wrote that publication, one of the Western media, that on the second day after Trump's victory, Skabeyeva, one of the Putin's TV heads, talking about president-elect, was presenting the images of nude Melania Trump. And this surprised a lot in the West because it was taken as spit, as a challenge. Since you're remembering this, I'm remembering my interview with Alexander yesterday. That's speaking of psychological factors, don't know how important they are. Well, regarding the first question, I also was trying to remember whether it actually happened in the history of Russia or Soviet Union, if we're scrolling further down, because there are norms of diplomatic etiquette regardless of the relations between the countries. The norms of diplomatic etiquette require, if you maintain any relations, to at least make a formal congratulation. And one can say that Putin, of course, during his speech somewhere in Valdai Club, he did mention that he is congratulating Mr. Trump in his speech, but there are norms of diplomatic etiquette which require that you either make a phone call, and it's a formal, it could be just a 5-minute quick phone call. Hello, my congratulations, have all kinds of success. That's it. Absolute formality, but an important formality that is being followed, or a telegram that is being sent. Verbal congratulations in some obscure forum, this is not a diplomatic congratulation. Therefore, indeed, there was no formal congratulation following the diplomatic norms from Putin to President-elect. Right, I was not remembering any of this case as well. So you're reading it correct. This is a sign of not accepting, a sign of resistance, because any new leader of a big country, big player, such a communication is basically a nod of acknowledgement, welcome to the club, to the newly arrival. And it's hard to call Trump a new person on the scene, he is known, but still. But still, this is some sign of acknowledgement that we have another person, another contact among us. But what was done on the first channel, on the Putin's media, this is a direct attack, attack towards the spouse of the president-elect. By the way, a person whom Putin met personally. When they met together, Trump was with Melania, and they saw each other, they shook hands, and they were smiling at each other and sitting at the same table talking. So in this case, this is an attack, not only an attack gesture, not only at the spouse of the president, but at the person with whom he personally met. He personally talked, possibly were just basic niceties and compliments, but this is generally an attack. So one can ask a question, why did Putin do this? I think nobody has doubts that it is inspired and orchestrated by Putin. He did that to put Trump in a more difficult psychological situation, which is Trump, we know him and his position that was voiced time and time again, even before his first presidential term, during his campaign of 2016, during his whole first presidential term and the 4 years that followed. So Trump, for the last 9 years, is known to take certain positions, right? He's a rather open person. His positions are generally known. He does not like wars, and that is true. He personally, internally, on his ethical positions and religious position, he does not like wars. He does not like when people are dying. And he talked numerous times about people dying in Ukraine, about numbers of those who perished. This is his soul speaking, which is screaming at this point. You cannot hear that in Biden. You cannot hear that in Biden at all. In Kamala, it's completely absent. But in Trump, it is very visible. In April of 2017, when Assad used chemical weapons against Syrian civilian opposition, when he was talking about the kids who suffocated by those chemical gases, you could see that it is coming from his heart. And he is talking in the same fashion even more about dying Ukrainians. So on one side, he internally cannot accept the death of people to be a solution, especially in such a scale. He sincerely wants to finish this war and to try to put people at the negotiation table. In some fashion, very reminiscent of Zelensky's position back in 2019, who said, let's stop fighting, let's sit down at the negotiation table and solve all the matters. See, what do you need, what do I need, and find some common ground and solve it. Not a problem, right? So Trump, I think, is not so naive, but to a degree he is guided by his inner values, who wants to finish this war. He wants to finish the war with negotiations. He does not want to protract this fighting and suffering. And Putin understands that, and knowing it, he is increasing his bets to the maximum he can. To make those negotiations, when and if they happen, if they'll be organized by Trump, they would look for Trump in the eyes of American public and the eyes of the world as somewhat of a step down or surrendering his positions, not only Ukrainians, but also as capitulation of the United States. Because in this situation, Putin is more interested in the United States' position than in Ukraine's position. So he's trying to use in this game, in this colossal bloody game that he organized, he's using Ukraine, and I'm sorry, this is not my view, this is how he does it. He's using Ukraine as a bait to understanding Trump's attitude to the war and to Ukraine, to use it to bring down the position of Trump and to present it somehow as capitulation of the United States in the face of Putin and his country, in the eyes of the world. If he ever achieves that, that would be the result of his main effort, because he would then acquire not only some parts of Ukraine, but also a lot of authority by treating America like that. So he continues to increase the bets, and Skabeyeva TV show with nudes of Melania is part of it. It's another step. Yesterday's publication was another step in this escalation when they adjusted the doctrine of nuclear response by Russia, which caused a hysteria in the United States, actually. I don't know if you noticed this in Ukraine, but in the United States, there was literally some mad hysteria. The sky is falling in a lot of media outlets. In whose camps that hysteria is prevalent in the US? Oh, in both camps, especially in those among those who are called Putin Verstehen, and they're present in both parties, because among Democrats and among Republicans there are these. The most crazy text I've seen yesterday was the text by General Flynn, who during the first few months was an aide in national security for Trump at the very, very beginning of his first term. And because of the scandal, he was removed. And there were messages that there was information that he actually went to Moscow and he was giving a speech and he was paid $45,000 for participation. And then he was sitting at some supper at the next table to Putin. You know, people visit even if they get paid for money or whatever. How big is the honorarium? Clinton was getting $500,000 for his speeches whenever he travels, right? And Oprah got $1 million for her support to Kamala. So there are different honorariums for different statements. So 45,000 is not anything unique. And if somebody will be calling Flynn a Putin's pooch, not exactly so. But if you remember, he was also accused, that was about 2016, 2017, that he had negotiations with Kislyak, with the Russian ambassador in Washington. And Democrats were actually spinning that. And it's, by the way, it's good that there are two parties in the US. One party is bad. You need one party to be checking on the other party. So none of them would be making any atrocious moves. Right, so watchdog, right, exactly. So they spun this story, and all right, was there, not was there, don't care. But Flynn, actually, in his recent publication, managed to mention that he did talk with Kislyak, and he acknowledges that he talked with Kislyak to de-escalate situation and to give up some territories of Ukraine to Russia, or give Ukraine to Russian zone of influence. That's as if, we're criticizing Sullivan on the Democratic side as a scoundrel. We got Flynn on the Republican side. There are scumbags on both sides who are ready to give Ukraine and other countries and probably their soul up for a proper amount of money. So what I was saying here is that Putin made another step with his nuclear doctrine adaptation. Understandably, it was prepared a couple months ago. They had a special meeting in the Security Council. They organized and orchestrated all that. But he was picking when to publish it. And he published this decree when there was a leak about Biden allowing to use ATACMS on the military objects on the territory of Russian country proper in Kursk and nearby districts. So when that became known, Putin decided to escalate. So he's again increasing the stakes. And whom is he addressing in this case? Of course, Trump. What is he hopeful for? He's increasing the possible price of agreement that Trump talked about on numerous occasions. Putin understands well that Trump mentioned that agreement and peace deal so many times. He promised to finish this war, and he promised not because somebody pushed him, not because somebody is holding a rifle to his head. It's his inner need. Trump wants this war to be over. Putin understands that, and he is addressing it. He says, okay, great, you need to finish this war. I'm ready to help you, but I will give you such a high price for this, the maximum high price I can find of all possible prices, not only from the point of view of Ukraine territory, not only from the status of the country in the NATO, outside of NATO. No, he has not actually presented all conditions yet. Putin is not giving conditions for Trump. He has voiced some conditions for Ukraine, but not for United States yet. And we can remember December of 2021 about 2 projects of agreement about moving the line of NATO to the border of 1997 and removal of all countries who became NATO members since 1997 from NATO club. Do you think Putin forgot about that? No, of course not. He will pull this card later when it will be appropriate. The game is not over yet, and he will be pulling these cards out of his deck. And he will be increasing them, expecting that if Trump seriously needs that peace so much, or let's call it this way, the cessation of hostile activities, the cessation of active war, he's ready to sell it for the highest price he can acquire. And he talked about it a few times before. And in this situation, he is putting Trump in a fork position. Trump either needs to agree with all demands of Putin and go with this and give not only Ukraine, but also give up on NATO and Europe, speaking of European security, give up US interests, show everybody that he is not a tough negotiator or a wolf or the world policeman who has power and authority on the world arena, but then be present as some beaten up animal who can be bullied by any bully. Or Trump needs to repel that proposal. But to repel this proposal, there is only one way to continue this war. And it will be likely not with only Ukraine, but Ukraine with the United States and with NATO. And then Putin will have another great opportunity to say, well, look, we told you we've been fighting with NATO all the time. These are Western imperialists. They're telling us about peace, but in reality they're bloody and they want the war. They don't want to take our peace terms. Look, even Trump, who was speaking about cessation of this war, in reality he actually does want to continue this war, and even more, and he wants to escalate, because we continue talking that ever since America started giving the missiles or allowing to use these missiles in Russian territory, we've been always telling that we're fighting not with Ukraine, but with NATO at large. And even Trump's arrival to the scene only confirms that. So for Putin, that's the situation he would want to play. As the propaganda in his country continuously states that they're fighting with NATO, not with Ukraine, with NATO led by United States. And that is the game that Putin is demonstrating. And he's giving Trump a choice to realize his dream of peace, but completely surrender his interests, or denounce his dream, denounce desire to finish this war, and denounce his election promise to finish the war, and instead of what he promised to his electorate, which he actually did promise, that he will stop this war and the United States will not be participating in this war and there will not be any war there. You can hear in his rhetoric often, right, will not allow for the Third World War to happen, there'll be no nuclear conflict, etc. But in this situation, Putin is playing the game that, look, we will have a nuclear adjustments here to our laws, and if needed, we'll remind Trump that his escalation will lead to a nuclear war. So that's the game that Putin is playing now. And in the next weeks and months to come, we'll see how Putin is playing it. What is good in this situation? What is positive? At least in the first few weeks. The positive is that Trump has not taken a bait by Putin. And he is not fulfilling his election campaign promises about immediate calls to Zelensky and Putin with a suggestion to strike peace. I do not know, but I hope that Trump is smart enough to understand that with Zelensky, he can probably come to an agreement. Even though Zelensky's position was stated many times in different fashions, he has some capacity to negotiate. And under certain conditions, I think Zelensky and Ukrainian authorities will find it in themselves to sign a peace agreement. But he cannot agree with Putin. Why? Because being president-elect, he does not have the full power and authority. He lacks the instruments by which he can conduct, even if he will try to do that, somewhat notable or serious negotiations with Putin. No options yet. The only time when he will acquire such capability and real terms for conducting negotiations with Putin, it will be when he will be officially in power in the White House, be the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the United States, and will have full access to nuclear arsenal, ballistic missiles, nuclear submarines, etc. This is the first and most important condition to conduct any kind of serious negotiations with Putin. Second is to have Senate confirm Minister of Defense, new head of Chiefs of Staff, so the military head of United States, Director of CIA, Director of Intel, Secretary of State, the whole cabinet needs to be in power, and administration needs to start working. Administration needs to be sure that the whole mechanism is working, that the system has been transferred and new administration is functioning. This is an important component, and it will take some time. Not the 20th of January, right? It'll likely take some time after that, depending how quickly the whole thing will go. Do you think it can be half a year, 3 months, a month? Could be different. They hit the ground running early on, and Senate is promising, we'll see how they will fulfill, but they're promising to start reviewing candidates even before the 20th of January. That procedure is not common, but it has happened before. And the Senate is supposedly ready, starting the 3rd of January, to review the candidates and appoint them to these positions. So before the formal inauguration of a president. This is acceptable, and this will expedite the process. But even after that happens, one more thing needs to occur. What is in his head? He, of course, has a certain view of what arguments can be used, what negotiations can go, how he would juggle these interviews or negotiations with Putin. Perhaps what pictures can he take out? Remember him showing a picture of the house of the Afghani leader with whom they were conducting negotiations when Trump was the president, right? So he has different moves in his cache, but it's important that he would not be alone, that he would have a good working team behind him, and the team would be understanding the ideation of the leader, perhaps suggesting certain corrections and advice. So it's important for them to be working as a well-oiled machine before making the phone call to Putin and starting these negotiations. For example, I'm sorry for such a comparison, as a foreplay, there could be a dozen of American submarines patrolling the borders of Russia, right? Just to check the climate, weather, to make their presence known. Perhaps have strategic bombers flying not too far from the border of Russia. Perhaps have United States Navy and NATO ships entering the Black Sea. A lot of different things may start happening before negotiations, and they could be happening before, as if by their own volition, and there would still be no phone call to Putin. Putin is hoping to start negotiations, but nothing is happening. But planes start to fly faster, deeper, further. Submarines are approaching different outposts. There would be certain decisions made. Obviously, a decision about leaving the Kyoto Protocol, about rebuilding, continuing to build the Keystone Pipeline, additional agreements with Saudi Arabia. The prices on oil will start falling. The profits from oil will start dwindling to the Russian Federation, and there's still no phone call. Right? Like in that kid's poem, the mountains are getting higher, the clouds are getting darker. And all is that happening, but there's no phone call. And at some point, possibly, when the right conditions will be present for conducting negotiations on the right note, on the proper foot, when the side leading these negotiations will have all the cards in their hand, and some cards will already be in the military stations, that's when negotiations will probably be more fruitful. That's how I see that. It could be somewhat different, of course, in real world, how it unfolds, but in this logic, he should not be in a hurry. That's why he should not be too quick to make a phone call to one or the other, but first he needs to create conditions that could lead to success of these negotiations. Trump is the author of the bestseller, right? One of the main books that he wrote, The Art of the Deal, the art of negotiations. And the art, right? The fact that he likes deals, we know that. He continues to bring up different things in his life, and people are often accusing him of being a businessman who is only dealing with his interests. But he's not only a businessman, and why he is a successful one, because he understands the art of that deal. He understands how to affect your partner, opponent, competitor, the other party at the table. And people in New York jungle, they do know Trump pretty well, how he negotiates, and they do not necessarily like to negotiate with Trump, knowing his proclivities, because he prepares for each deal. He prepares himself and he prepares his opponent. And he's preparing certain arguments. I think if he is preparing his business deals in that fashion in New York, he was conducting certain deals during the 4 years of his presidency. And we know his deals with President of Mexico, with President of North Korea, and the Middle East, the Abraham Accords, right? So one way or another, he was rather successful. And some things, like Abraham agreements, they're absolutely remarkable, absolute masterpiece of diplomacy that definitely needs to be included in all books on diplomacy, how it should be done in the region where countries were warring for hundreds of years. These opponents, that they would not be in any peace condition by themselves, his administration came in and figured out how to do that. So, in this part, going back to your fundamental question, the vision that he has on the relations of Ukraine and with Europe, that was voiced clearly at the beginning of his first presidential term. He was saying, Europe, in the economic potential, you're comparable with the United States. Slightly smaller, but on the economic potential, it's on par. And if you take all the population of Europe, it is actually a bit bigger, quite bigger than the United States. So these are two gigantic blocks of the Western civilization, of the Western political and economic and military and financial world. And now let's look at the correlation of military potentials, and it's incomparable. United States spent about $900 billion on their military expenses. Europe, if I remember right, maybe 350. So correlation of 3 to 1, right? One can ask a big question here. These new countries that we started our conversation today with, India, China, Iran, and the rest, and semi-governmental or para-governmental organizations like Houthis, like Hamas, like Hezbollah, or illegal migrants that are permeating both Europe and United States and attacking the values of the West civilization. One can pose a question, who will be defending Western civilization? And in this picture of the world, it is very obvious that one of the most sharp flashpoints that can explode at any moment is Taiwan. Due to actions of continental China and their aspirations to capture Taiwan. And China is not concealing their intentions, and Putin is only adding oil to that fire, saying that Russia will be with China, helping China to acquire Taiwan. Who will be defending Taiwan? Europe? No, they won't. Obvious reasons, right? Who will be defending Taiwan? United States of America. So, United States has China as the main adversary. By its economic potential, they're about equal. And the purchasing power, China is actually bigger. Military potentials are comparable as well. So, of course, Europe is not a significant participant in this conflict. Japan may participate, South Korea and Australia may participate, maybe New Zealand. But even combined military potential of all these countries will only add a little more to an American potential, but it will not add even additional 50% to what America has. The main role in this fight on the South Pacific theater will be played by United States. So, question then, who will be defending Europe? An obvious question for any strategist who is thinking about the possibility of a global war, be hot or cold, and that is happening on different theaters of military action. If the United States will be present on all the fronts, they will not be able to win anywhere, because it is not a war against Houthis or Grenada or Afghanistan or Iraq, and not even Iran. This is against China. This is where you'll need all resources of the United States and all the allies to prevent Taiwan from being captured. Therefore, Europe remains practically alone without the United States in case of this conflict. Of course, there will be some military presence left in Europe. Of course, there will be some nuclear umbrella over Europe, but Europe will have to fight for European continent. Nobody else will do it for them. And this simple thought that Trump understood a long time ago, United States understood a long time ago, Trump was trying to explain this thought to Europe. And Europeans were stubbornly resisting to accepting it, because they were too busy with their wokeism, with their fight with climate change, with their affinity to illegal immigrants and helping them to integrate European life. And they were closing eyes to the real threat. And despite of all the demands and asks and appeals within the framework of NATO, Europeans were refusing to increase it. What did Trump do? Trump did what he described in his book, The Art of the Deal. What was he doing in the jungle of New York for decades? He used the same methods of basically blackmail that he used against his business partner. He used that against partners in Europe. He said, then we will not be protecting you. And oh, miracle, he actually was believed then. And during the 4 years of Trump administration, European countries, NATO members, have increased their military expenditures by $50 billion in real value. And the United States added $55 billion as well. So they were doing it jointly. This does not tell us that United States are using Europe as a shield. No, the United States was doing their own part of the bet. Europe was started to do something that they have not done for 2 or 3 decades before Trump came to power. Europe started to work jointly with the United States to defend not United States, not Taiwan, not South Korea, but to defend itself. Because Europe, who for the whole history of European world was just fighting all the time between themselves, it's just strange that they cannot defend themselves these days. So, in Trump's vision, it's important to make sure that Europe is covered, so that the United States would be able to dedicate their help to Taiwan when the time comes. And Europe would be able to defend itself in this situation because they have enough people, enough economic potential, enough military potential, and they do have nuclear powers and nuclear weapons present. So they have everything necessary. And here again, like the last time, I cannot not add to that Vladimir Zelensky, of course, there are a lot of questions to him, but here he understood it absolutely correctly. Trump's idea, Trump's concept about defending the free world, not only the West, but generally the free world at large. And he did what he could, as he, representative of Ukraine, can contribute to the concept of defense of free world from aggressive neighbors that are trying to change the borders. And with his message to his Rada, to his Congress, he said that after the end of the war that Ukraine is engaged in, armed forces of Ukraine can be playing a significant role in building the security system of Europe at large, as the country that has the most professional, the most experienced, and the biggest army on the European continent, which today Ukraine armed forces are, or seem to be, which actually is acknowledged in Europe, however they like it or not. But looking at the current situation with weapons, with mobilization, with munitions, they still acknowledge that in Europe. Right, that is obvious. So this is not too important whether by the time when this war is over, who will be in charge of Ukraine, who will be leading the country. The suggestion itself is an absolutely reasonable, deep, because it includes Ukraine in the system of European security. So that exact thing that you asked me about at the beginning, and that was discussed at the conference where you were present. Not because of all kinds of papers. Remember all these guarantees of security that were signed, I think, with Portugal, right? Well, Andrei, you just called all the important contracts papers. Right, those agreements with Liechtenstein, with Malta, and with Andorra, Ukraine absolutely had to sign something because it's a super important partner about guarantees of mutual security. But after these 3 bloody years of war, Ukrainian authorities finally, together with Zelensky, get to real understanding of the problems that they have, not only for Ukraine, but for the other regions as well. And understanding the realities of both Europe and United States. And Ukraine, for the first time, is suggesting a somewhat realistic option to conduct future actions together, future actions to ensure mutual security, to make sure security is provided not only for Ukraine, but the whole European continent. And seeing these suggestions, seeing that they do exist and it's not a bluff, and these are not empty papers, but there's real military force behind that. These are the good arguments that cannot be not taken into consideration by both European and American partners. And these suggestions are key elements to the beginning of serious conversation about how to form the real coalition of partners, not Rammstein fakery, but the real coalition of allies. Not partners, allies, who are helping each other to defend from common threats. Andrei, then let me ask you one more nuance in this case. There is an understanding now that the United States and Europe are against Russia. Do you think they somehow already let Putin create his own bloc that formally may look now like Russia, North Korea, that ratified some agreement, and I understand similar agreement they're preparing with Iran that they talked about a few times earlier? And if China adds here to this group, that may actually change the configuration at the bigger board in this world, or is it too early to talk about it? And for Trump, both North Korea, which is currently an ally de facto of Russia, and Iran is also an ally of Russia, they're all in his international areas of interests. So in this case, the roads still go through Russia. Well, first of all, you're right. Putin indeed succeeded in creating a coalition of allies, and including allies whose armed forces are actually participating actively on the front, like North Korean. And the members of this coalition of real allies on that side is, of course, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and Belarus. These are real participants of that coalition. And the agreements between them do differ a bit. Conditions, terms are a little different, but these are 4 countries that are the participants of this coalition. From this point of view, on the side of Ukraine, there is not a single ally. Ukraine is alone. There are no agreements that in some fashion would be looking like agreements between Russia and these other 3 countries, North Korea, Iran, and Belarus. They don't exist. All these agreements about guarantees of security and all that, they do not provide this level of engagement. So for Ukraine, there is a very simple conclusion stemming out of it, the one that we've been discussing since August of 21, about the need to form a real coalition of Ukraine and its allies, even before the full-scale aggression of Russia began. So this is the first element, and it's absolutely correct. Now, is China a part of that coalition? So far, no. There is not a single contract between Russia and China that would be reminiscent of the type of agreement they're signing with Korea and Belarus and the others. So the declaration that Putin signed during Olympic Games about cooperation, etc., this is just a general ballpark declaration that has no meat underneath it. You can see that during the 4 years of this full-scale aggression, China still holds itself from supplying arms to Russia. While they're not supplying arms to Ukraine, of course, they are nevertheless not supplying arms to Russia. Yes, they are purchasing a lot of resources from Russia and participate in different kinds of trade with Putin's Russia, but they're not actively participating in the hot war itself. Now, as for the other side, look at the agreements that Putin had with Iran, Belarus, North Korea, and including Belarus much tighter in its orbit and placing some tactical nukes there. When did that all happen? That happened under Biden administration. Not a single step of these occurred during Trump's presidency. And this remains a big question whether these actions would have been taken if Trump was in the White House at this time. Maybe yes, maybe no, but de facto that has not happened during the first term of Trump, and it happened during the term of Biden. And we can see that situation today is much more complex for Ukraine, for the United States, and for the whole world, because the coalition of aggressors, it became stronger, it fortified, it established relations between its members, which were not quite present at the beginning. And sequentially, Trump will have to resolve not only the matter with Russia, but also these matters with Iran, with North Korea, and whether you like it or not, he will have to deal with them as part of coalition. Of course, Russia is the leader in it, and she should be getting most attention, but each other country are now members of that coalition. And that timeout that I think he is taking now is to consider not only what to do with Putin's Russia and how to talk to Putin, but also what to do with Iran and what to do with North Korea. And knowing Trump, we know him a bit, and having seen what he was doing the previous 4 years, we can be quite sure that he's preparing some significant surprises for the elites of Pyongyang and Tehran. Of course, he'll be saying, you guys are cool, You look fantastic. We'll definitely have business relations with you. We'll sign agreements and all. And I respect you. You have respect for me. And our media will be, of course, screaming both in Ukraine and in the States that Trump had sold himself again. But he will not be saying the dumb statements that Biden was, that Putin is a murderer, he is son of a bitch, etc. He will not be saying that. In this regard, he is a gentleman from the Viennese Ball. He is not a hooligan from, like, he's not a Irish hooligan from Creighton, Pennsylvania, or wherever Biden is. He will not be doing this dumb things. He'll be holding the style and following the needed minimums for democratic etiquette. He'll be following with the norms, but behind these norms and under this charming, offensive blanket, Trump will be setting a very spiky hedgehog under the nether parts of his counterparts from North Korea, Tehran, and Russia. We should not doubt that. Now, what kind of needles would that be? How they will affect those leaders, we are to see, but I do not see him refusing from that style. Knowing him and seeing him, the person with these ambitions, the person who publicly, for the whole world, remember we talked about that in July after Trump and Biden debates, when Trump mentioned not only certain achievements in the economy, but he did outline that under each recent American president, Putin did take a bite of neighboring territory. The only president under which he did not take any was under Trump. So, having stated this ethical principle for the whole world out loud, and having tied himself to this principle, he will not be ceding it back to Putin. That doesn't fit with his psychological profile. Andrey Nikolayevich, and maybe one more last question, if we have a few minutes. Don't you think that now for the United States to return its position, and we can maybe not call it a policeman, but just call it a heavy, influential position in the world, America needs to undertake a lot of steps, and it's not obvious how it will end, right? Why am I thinking about it is because yesterday Australian TV was showing these clips, and maybe you'll correct me and say that it's usual diplomacy, but at the meeting of G20, when the leaders were aligned together for the big photo shoot, Biden was running late. So at first they made a picture without him. And in the middle, there was a Chinese leader. And when the photographer said, well, let's wait for Biden, let's make another picture, G20 representatives, presidents turned and left. Why did they pay attention to that? I maybe would not have noticed, but Australian television, maybe some others also paid attention to, but Australian TV was very vocal about it. And that's what I saw. And that is a visualization of some processes, I think. Or do you correct me? Maybe I'm just intriguing here and it's wrong, but it seemed rather symbolic. And there was another little clip that also amazed me when Biden was giving his speech on the backdrop of jungle, and then at the end of the speech he turned around and unknowingly why, there were no aides maybe to guide him, he just turned and went into the jungle, and that became a reason for a ton of heckling and memes and jokes about Biden. Where is he going? He's going somewhere in the depth of the jungle. And I was thinking, this is not even about Biden. This is also maybe symbolic about the United States. Or is it somewhat like Mowgli when the leader has missed and now everybody's trying to team with a different leader? You know, Lyudmila, you paid very keen attention to this very symbolic and very bright examples. And each of them, both of them, they support what we were talking about at the very beginning, that the world today, as the world always, political world, is the world of jungle. It is not the world of a big highway. It is not the world of Christmas balls. It is the world of the jungle, which usually allows the strongest one to win, and the weakest one is usually being preyed upon. And in this regard, the words said many years ago about the wolves and what humans are to each other, they remain real for this level. Trump understood that from the very beginning. This is the rules he's playing by his whole life. Biden is refusing to understand or take these rules. Neither Biden nor Kamala nor Obama. These are people, knowingly or unknowingly, are involved, engaged in burying United States as the biggest, strongest country of the modern world. The country that, reluctantly perhaps, but was playing the role of the international policeman. Policemen in this international jungle that are filled with hooligans, with gangsters, with thieves, and other groups and interests who are ready to attack their neighbor and destroy them if the opportune moment presents itself. Yes, of course, this policeman was not always perfect. Yes, this policeman made a few mistakes. But with this international policeman, the whole world was a much safer place. Without one, we are looking at a chance for a war of everyone against everyone, which is very well described by European authors of 16th and 17th centuries. The war of free-for-all, everyone against everyone. And this symbolic moment in G20 meeting, when Biden walked into the jungle, the real jungle of modern politics, has no friends. The friends are determined by the level of power and the relations to boss in this situation. If there is no boss, then the weakest is going to be torn apart. Not the strongest, but the weakest. So who is mostly interested in the presence of such a police force? The weak countries. The strong ones do not need that. They dream about spheres of influence, with the help of which they can feast on the weak. Who is mostly interested in the system of international relations, in established rules? The weak ones, because otherwise they will be devoured. Pay attention, by the way. The only region in the world at large where you can find mini countries, mini states such as Vatican, Monaco, San Marino, Liechtenstein, Andorra, and Luxembourg. Not any other region of the world would enable their existence. They would have been devoured. Oh, that's an interesting observation. I never even thought of it. Right? Andorra, what's the population of it? 40,000 people? Or San Marino, that I think is 25,000. Vatican, 1,000. Monaco, such a tasty bite. Citizens of Monaco, maybe there are 30,000 at best. They could have been devoured by France or any other country neighboring them. How come they survived? Because only in one region of the world where it was established and developed as a thing, the Western civilization, Western culture. Inherent part of it is respect to another, is attempt to preserve the existence of somebody who is different from you, that respect to their culture and their rules and letting them be. Not any other country in the world or region in the world has it. If you look at Asia, their history is the history of endless wars, just like Europe at a certain stage. But in Europe, pretty early, they established certain rules and borders that were maintained at different rulers. France established its borders by the end of 10th century, same with Germany, some other countries, maybe 2-3 centuries later. And in Asia, the borders continued changing, or Middle East as well. The Mongolian empires, other countries, other civilizational groups. Why? Only in one area of the modern civilization, due to this Western civilization, the way it is established, and the way that there is respect to another country, to other borders, to other people, it allows for this phenomenon to exist. Some tolerance, some modicum of respect, so that these little ones, dwarf states, could have been preserved there. Why? Because the big ones nearby, they were not in a hurry to devour them. They have devoured quite a few, right, but not all of them, and some of them were preserved. And in other parts of the world, none were preserved. It doesn't mean that Western civilization actually takes pity on others. So there were other historical moments, but at least it has these windows, these chances to preserve things. And in other civilizations and other cultures, there are no windows, no chances. Same thing with us here. Do we have a guarantee that we'll succeed after the 5th of November? There are no guarantees, but we have a chance. Until the 5th of November, United States, and jointly with them the whole world, were following the path of non-Western civilization, of destruction of Western values and Western civilization, because international sheriff decided to give up all his responsibilities and sheriff star and his gun to the gangsters from the nearby village. And that is exactly what they were doing. Biden's administration were giving coffers with gold to Iranian ayatollahs or giving goodies to Kremlin, long dweller, and they continue doing that. They continue destroying the West. Now, in 2 months, we will have a chance for the international sheriff to be back and to find a place where did he park his Colt, Winchester, and the other important attributes to preserve peace and security and international relations in the global world that consists to a large degree from wild jungle, where there are a lot of different scary animals live that most countries have very strong interest to be defended and protected from. Andrey Nikolayevich, thank you so much for finding time for us. I apologize that we ran over, but we had a ton of questions. Thank you to Lyudmila. Andrey Illarionov was our guest today, for which we are absolutely thankful, and of course to you, to your supporters.